The coffee maker had been gurgling for 20 minutes straight. Marcus stared at it from behind the security desk, watching the brown liquid drip with mechanical precision into the glass pot that should have been full by now. He'd started working the night shift at Meridian Office Complex 3 weeks ago. 12 floors of empty cubicles, conference rooms, and the kind of corporate silence that felt heavier than noise. The building housed insurance companies, accounting firms, a dental office on the 4th floor. Nothing exciting, nothing that should keep him awake at night, replaying every detail of his rounds. The elevator dinged softly behind him. Marcus turned, expecting to see the empty car with its doors sliding open like they sometimes did when the building settled. Instead, he saw Janet from the cleaning crew, stepping out with her cart. "Evening, Marcus," she said, pulling her yellow rubber gloves tighter. "How's the night treating you?" "Fine," he replied, though his voice caught slightly. Janet had been cleaning these floors for 15 years, according to her employee badge. She knew every stain on every carpet, every burnt-out bulb that needed replacing. But Janet had called in sick 3 days ago. Her supervisor had mentioned it during the shift briefing. "Good to hear," Janet continued, wheeling her cart toward the elevator bank. "Building's been quiet lately. Too quiet, if you ask me." Marcus watched her disappear into the service elevator. The floors above him creaked as she began her routine, vacuuming, emptying trash bins, wiping down surfaces that accumulated dust even in an empty building. He could hear her humming faintly, a tune he didn't recognize but found oddly familiar. At 2:47 a.m., Marcus began his rounds. The security protocol required him to check each floor every 2 hours, scanning his key card at designated checkpoints to prove he'd completed the circuit. The elevator carried him smoothly to the 12th floor, its fluorescent lights casting everything in a pale, clinical glow. The accounting firm on 12 always felt different at night. During the day, it buzzed with phone calls, printer noise, the constant clicking of keyboards. Now the cubicles stood like a maze of fabric walls and dark computer monitors. Marcus walked through them slowly, his footsteps muffled by industrial carpet that absorbed sound like a sponge. He was halfway through the floor when he heard typing. Slow, deliberate keystrokes echoed from somewhere in the cubicle maze. Marcus stopped, listening carefully. The sound came from his left, near the windows that looked out over the city's scattered lights. He followed the noise, weaving between desks and filing cabinets, until he reached cubicle 12C. A woman sat at the computer, her back to him. She wore a navy blue blazer and had her dark hair pulled into a neat bun. Her fingers moved steadily over the keyboard, filling the screen with lines of text Marcus couldn't quite read from his angle. "Excuse me," he said softly. "Building's closed." The woman continued typing. Marcus stepped closer, noticing that her monitor displayed what looked like financial reports, columns of numbers, client names, profit margins, all perfectly normal for an accounting firm, except for the timestamp in the corner of the screen that read 3:03 a.m. "Ma'am?" Marcus tried again, reaching out to tap her shoulder. His hand passed through empty air. The chair was empty. The computer screen showed nothing but a blank screensaver, the same geometric pattern that had been cycling for hours. Marcus backed away slowly, his hand trembling as he reached for his radio. But before he could call it in, he heard Janet's voice echoing from the stairwell. "Marcus, you up there? Got something to show you." He found Janet on the 8th floor, standing beside a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows. Inside, the long table was set for a meeting, papers arranged neatly at each seat, water glasses filled, pens laid out with corporate precision. "Wasn't like this when I cleaned earlier," Janet said, her voice carrying an odd note of satisfaction. "Someone's working late." Marcus checked his watch. 3:17 a.m. He'd seen the building's access logs. No one had entered after 6 p.m. except for him and Janet. But Janet was supposed to be sick. "I should call the main office," Marcus said, pulling out his phone. "No signal," Janet replied before he could check. "Never is during the night shift. Building's got too much steel in the walls." Marcus looked at his phone. No bars. He'd been receiving texts and calls all week, but now the screen showed nothing but a dead connection. "That's why they pay you to walk the floors," Janet continued, "to see what needs seeing." On the 6th floor, Marcus found more evidence of after-hours activity. Lights were on in the dental office, though the switches had been turned off when he'd checked earlier. Through the frosted glass door, he could see shadows moving. A dentist working late, perhaps, or a patient receiving emergency treatment. Marcus pressed his ear to the door. He heard the high-pitched whine of a dental drill, the suction of a vacuum, the muffled sounds of someone in distress. He tried the handle, but the door was locked from the inside. "Should we check on them?" he asked Janet, who had appeared behind him with her cart. "Not our job," she said simply. "We just clean and guard. Let the day shift handle the rest." By 4 a.m., Marcus had documented 17 instances of impossible activity. Computers running in empty offices, meetings in conference rooms that should have been dark, phones ringing in cubicles where no one sat to answer them. Each time he tried to investigate further, Janet would appear with a reasonable explanation or a gentle suggestion to move along. The worst was the elevator on the 5th floor. When the doors opened, Marcus saw a group of office workers inside, men in suits, women in business attire, all staring straight ahead with the patient expression of people riding to their floor. They didn't acknowledge Marcus, or Janet didn't react when Marcus tried to speak to them. "Going up," the elevator's automated voice announced, though the car was clearly going down. The doors closed and Marcus watched the floor indicator descend. 4, 3, 2, 1, B, and then beyond into floors that didn't exist in the building's blueprint. The indicator kept dropping, B2, B3, B4, until it disappeared entirely. "That's been happening all week," Janet said, as if reading his thoughts. "Ever since the new night guard started." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "I'm the new night guard." Janet smiled, her expression kind but somehow wrong. "Are you?" At 5:30 a.m., as the first hints of dawn began to brighten the windows, Marcus made a discovery that changed everything. In the security office, he found a file cabinet he'd never noticed before, old metal with a lock that had been broken long ago. Inside were personnel records dating back decades. His own file was on top, but the photo wasn't him. The man in the picture had his name, his social security number, his address, but a different face entirely. The hire date was listed as 3 weeks ago, but the termination date was yesterday. Beneath his file was another with the same name, different photo, hired 6 months ago, terminated after 3 weeks. Then another Marcus and another going back years. Dozens of them, all hired as night security, all lasting exactly 3 weeks before their termination date. The final file in the stack was different, Janet's picture, but dated from 1987. Her termination date was listed as 15 years ago, the night she'd died in the building during a robbery gone wrong. The security guard on duty that night had been named Marcus. Marcus looked up to find Janet standing in the doorway, her cleaning cart beside her, her yellow rubber gloves bright against the dawn light filtering through the windows. "Your shift's almost over," she said gently. "Day crew will be here soon." "I don't understand," Marcus whispered. "What's happening to me?" "Same thing that happened to all the others," Janet replied. "Building needs a night guard, someone who will walk the floors, check the doors, make sure everything stays in its place. Someone who won't ask too many questions about what goes on after dark." Marcus felt himself fading, his memories of the outside world growing dim. His apartment, his car, his life before this job, it all seemed less real than the fluorescent lights and empty cubicles around him. "The replacement starts tonight," Janet continued. "Same name, different face. He'll last 3 weeks just like you did, just like they all do." As the morning sun filled the security office with golden light, Marcus understood. The building didn't just need a night guard, it needed a guardian, someone to watch over the employees who never left, who worked eternal shifts in offices that existed somewhere between memory and reality. He looked at his watch one last time. 6 a.m. His shift was over. Tomorrow night, another Marcus would take his place, and the cycle would continue. Janet smiled and began pushing her cart toward the elevator. "See you tomorrow night, Marcus. Buildings always got work for those who know how to watch." The elevator doors closed behind her, and Marcus realized he was no longer alone in the empty building. He was home. The radio crackled to life at exactly 3:33 a.m., cutting through the silence of Darren's overnight shift like a rusty knife. He'd been monitoring the emergency frequencies for the county dispatch center for 8 years, but he'd never heard this particular signal before. Static first, then a voice. Young, female, terrified. "This is Sarah Chen, badge number 4471. I'm trapped in the old Riverside Elementary on Maple Street. Please, someone answer me." Darren leaned forward in his chair, adjusting the volume on his headset. Riverside Elementary had been demolished 6 months ago. He'd driven past the empty lot just last week, nothing but concrete foundation and scattered debris where the building used to stand. "Unit 4471, this is dispatch," Darren responded, following protocol despite his confusion. "What's your current situation?" "The children," Sarah's voice came through clearly now, no longer distorted by static. "They won't let me leave. They keep asking me to read them stories, but the books are wrong." Darren checked his computer system. Badge 4471 belonged to Sarah Chen, a social worker who'd been killed in a car accident 3 months ago. Her funeral had made the local news, a young woman dedicated to helping troubled kids gone too soon. "Sarah, I need you to stay calm," Darren said, his training taking over even as cold sweat began to form on his forehead. "Can you describe your surroundings?" "I'm in the library," she replied, her voice echoing as if she were speaking in a large, empty room. "It's exactly like it was when I used to visit. The same reading circle, the same colorful carpet with the alphabet border. But the children, they're not right." Darren had worked dispatch long enough to handle strange calls, people claiming to see ghosts, reporting aliens, calling about monsters in their basements. Usually he could tell when someone was having a mental health crisis or playing a prank. This felt different. Sarah's voice carried the kind of authentic terror that couldn't be faked. "What do you mean they're not right?" Darren asked, typing notes into his incident report. "They look like the kids I used to work with, but their faces are too pale and their eyes..." Sarah's voice broke slightly. "Their eyes are completely black, and they keep showing me their books. Every page is the same story over and over, about a woman who came to help them and never left." Darren's hands froze over the keyboard. He'd been a dispatcher long enough to know that sometimes the calls you couldn't explain were the ones that stayed with you. But this was different. This felt like something reaching across impossible distances to find him. "Sarah, I'm going to send someone to check on you," Darren said, though he knew no one could respond to a location that no longer existed. "Don't," Sarah's voice came back immediately, sharp with panic. "Don't send anyone else here. That's how they get new people. That's how they got me." The radio fell silent except for the steady hiss of static. Darren tried to raise Sarah again, but got no response. He sat back in his chair, staring at the glowing displays of his equipment. trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. 20 minutes later, the radio crackled again. Different voice, male, older. "This is Officer Jim Hawkins, badge 2156. I'm at the Riverside Elementary site. Found a car here, dispatch. Looks like it's been here for months." Darren's blood went cold. He knew Jim Hawkins. They'd worked together for years before Jim retired from the police force last spring. Jim was supposed to be living in Florida now, fishing and enjoying his pension. "Jim, what's your current status?" Darren asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Cars registered to Sarah Chen," Jim continued, static making his words come in and out. "Interiors covered in dust, but there's something strange. The radio's still on, and it's tuned to our frequency." Darren pulled up Jim's file in the system. "James Hawkins, badge 2156, status, deceased. Heart attack 2 months ago, while fishing in the Gulf of Mexico. His body had been found 3 days later, floating face down near his boat." "Jim, I need you to step away from the vehicle," Darren said, though he wasn't sure why. Some instinct was telling him that this conversation should end, that some doors shouldn't be opened. "Can't do that, dispatch," Jim replied, his voice growing fainter. "There's something else here. Kids playing in the grass where the playground used to be. They're waving at me. They want me to come play with them." "Jim, there's no playground there anymore. The whole school was demolished." "I can see it clear as day," Jim insisted. "Swings, slide, jungle gym. Kids are having the time of their lives. Little girl in a red dress is asking me to push her on the swing. Says her name is Emily." Darren's hands trembled as he typed. Emily Rodriguez, age 7, had been murdered at Riverside Elementary 12 years ago. Her body had been found behind the school building, and the case had never been solved. The community had never quite recovered from the tragedy. "Jim, you need to leave that area immediately," Darren said, his dispatcher training warring with a growing sense of dread. "Too late." Jim's voice was barely audible now. "They've got me surrounded. Kids everywhere, all wanting to play, all wanting me to stay. The little girl in red is smiling at me, and she looks so lonely." The radio went dead. For the next hour, Darren tried to raise both Sarah and Jim, but got only static in response. He considered calling his supervisor, reporting the strange transmissions, but he knew how it would sound. Dead people don't use radios. Buildings don't exist after they've been demolished. He'd handled enough psychiatric emergency calls to know the difference between reality and delusion. At 5:15 a.m., a new voice came through the radio, young, male, professional. "Dispatch, this is Lieutenant Mike Torres, badge 3891. I've got multiple units at the Riverside Elementary site responding to reports of suspicious activity." Darren knew Mike Torres. They'd gone to high school together, played on the same basketball team. Mike had been a good cop, dedicated, reliable. Mike had also been dead for 4 years, killed in the line of duty during a domestic violence call. "Mike," Darren said slowly, "what's your situation?" "We've got at least 20 people here, dispatch. Men, women, children. They're all just standing around where the building used to be, like they're waiting for something. None of them will respond to verbal commands." "Can you describe them?" "That's the weird part," Mike continued, his voice crystal clear despite the impossible nature of the call. "I recognize some of them. Sarah Chen from social services, she's been missing for months. Jim Hawkins from the department, though he's supposed to be retired. And there's a bunch of kids I remember from old missing persons cases." Darren felt the room growing colder around him. Outside his window, the city was beginning to wake up. Early commuters heading to work, delivery trucks making their rounds, normal life continuing while he sat in his dispatch center, taking calls from the dead. "Mike, I need you to maintain your position and wait for backup," Darren said, following a protocol that didn't exist for situations like this. "Can't do that, dispatch. They're calling to me, all of them. They want me to join them. They're saying it's my turn to come home. Mike, do not approach them. That's an order." "It's not an order anymore," Mike replied, his voice growing distant. "My shift ended a long time ago. I just forgot to log out." The radio fell silent again, leaving Darren alone with the hum of his equipment and the growing certainty that something was very wrong with the night frequency. At 6 a.m., as the day shift dispatcher arrived to relieve him, Darren gathered his things and prepared to leave. He'd written up the incident reports, documented the impossible calls, but he knew they'd be filed away and forgotten. Some things were too strange to believe, too impossible to investigate. As he walked to his car, Darren found himself driving toward Maple Street, toward the empty lot where Riverside Elementary used to stand. He told himself he was just curious, just wanted to see the site in daylight, to convince himself that everything was normal. The lot was empty, just as it should be. Concrete foundation, scattered debris, weeds growing through cracks in the pavement, no playground, no building, no people. Just an empty space where something had once been. But as Darren sat in his car, he heard his radio crackle to life one more time. His personal radio, the one he used to monitor emergency frequencies during his commute. "This is dispatcher Darren Walsh, badge 7742, the voice said. And with growing horror, Darren realized it was his own voice. "I'm trapped at the old Riverside Elementary site. The others are here with me. They're saying it's time for me to start my real shift." Darren looked at his badge, clipped to his shirt pocket. Badge number 7742. He looked at his hands, pale in the morning light, and noticed they were becoming translucent. "Please," his own voice continued over the radio. "Someone answer me. They won't let me leave. They keep saying the night frequency never really ends." Darren tried to respond, tried to key his radio, but his hands passed through the equipment. He looked up at the empty lot and saw it as it really was. Not empty at all, but full of people. Sarah Chen, Jim Hawkins, Mike Torres, and dozens of others. All the voices he'd heard over the years, all the calls he'd taken from people who were already gone. They were waving at him, smiling, welcoming him to join their eternal shift. Darren's radio crackled one more time. "This is dispatch. We'll send someone to check on you." But Darren knew better now. He knew that whoever answered the call would just become another voice on the night frequency, another guardian of the space between the living and the dead. As the morning sun rose higher, Darren walked toward his new colleagues, toward the building that existed somewhere between memory and reality, ready to begin his real job, taking calls from the lost and guiding them home. Tommy Reeves had been making security rounds at Moon Hill Cemetery for 6 months when he first noticed the fresh flowers. Every morning at 5 a.m., he'd walk the perimeter paths, checking for vandalism, making sure the groundskeeping equipment was secure, ensuring that the peaceful silence of the dead remained undisturbed. The flowers appeared on a grave in Section D, near the old oak tree that had been growing there for over a century. Margaret Whitmore, 1923 to 1987, beloved wife and mother. Someone had left a small bouquet of yellow roses on her headstone, arranged with the kind of care that spoke of genuine love and remembrance. Nothing unusual about that. Families visited graves all the time, left flowers, said prayers, shared memories with those who couldn't answer back. What made Tommy pause was that he'd walked past Margaret's grave just 2 hours earlier at 3 a.m., and there had been no flowers then. The ground around her headstone had been bare except for the well-maintained grass that covered the entire cemetery. Tommy checked his security log. No one had entered the cemetery between his 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. rounds. The gates were locked, the walls were too high to climb easily, and the motion sensors would have alerted him to any intruders. Yet someone had managed to visit Margaret Whitmore, and leave flowers without him noticing. The next night, Tommy paid special attention to Section D. He made extra passes through the area, lingering near Margaret's grave, listening for any sounds that might indicate someone moving through the cemetery under cover of darkness. At 3 a.m., the grave was bare. At 5 a.m., there were fresh flowers again, this time white lilies arranged in a perfect circle around the base of the headstone. On the third night, Tommy decided to stake out the grave. He positioned himself behind the oak tree at 4 a.m., settling in with a clear view of Margaret's headstone. The cemetery was perfectly quiet, the kind of deep silence that only comes in places where the living rarely venture after dark. At 4:23 a.m., he saw her. An elderly woman approached Margaret's grave, walking slowly along the path with the careful steps of someone whose bones had grown fragile with age. She wore a dark blue dress that looked like it belonged to another era, and her white hair was pinned up in a style Tommy recognized from old photographs. She carried a small bouquet of flowers, red roses this time, and knelt beside the headstone with obvious difficulty. Tommy watched as the woman placed the flowers gently against the stone, then reached out to trace the carved letters of Margaret's name with one finger. Her lips moved as if she were speaking, though Tommy couldn't hear her words from his hiding place. What disturbed him wasn't the woman's presence. People sometimes visited graves at odd hours, especially if they were grieving or couldn't sleep. What disturbed him was that the woman looked exactly like the photograph on Margaret Whitmore's headstone. The photo was small, etched into the granite below Margaret's name, showing a young woman with bright eyes and a warm smile. The woman kneeling at the grave had the same face, the same bone structure, the same gentle expression, but aged by decades, weathered by time and loss. Tommy blinked, and the woman was gone. The flowers remained, fresh and perfect against the dark stone. The next morning, Tommy went to the cemetery office and asked Mrs. Henderson, the cemetery administrator, about Margaret Whitmore. Mrs. Henderson had worked at Moonhill for 30 years and knew the history of almost every grave on the grounds. "Sad story," Mrs. Henderson said, pulling out a thick file. Margaret lost her daughter in a car accident back in 1985. Young woman named Helen, only 25 years old. Margaret was devastated. Helen was her only child. She visited the grave every day for 2 years, bringing flowers, talking to Helen like she was still alive. Tommy felt a chill run down his spine. What happened to Margaret? Died of a broken heart, basically. The doctor called it heart failure, but everyone knew she'd just given up. She's buried right next to Helen, actually. Section D, near the oak tree. Tommy's mouth went dry. "Can you show me Helen's grave?" Mrs. Henderson led him to Section D, to a headstone just 10 feet away from Margaret's. Helen Whitmore, 1960 to 1985, beloved daughter. The photograph on Helen's headstone showed a young woman with bright eyes and a warm smile, the same face Tommy had seen the night before, but decades younger. "Here's the strange thing," Mrs. Henderson continued. "After Margaret died, people started reporting that they'd seen her at the cemetery at night, visiting Helen's grave. Security guards, groundskeepers, even some of the funeral home staff, always around 4 a.m., always bringing flowers." Tommy stared at the two graves side by side and felt the pieces of an impossible puzzle clicking into place. "Mrs. Henderson, which grave have I been seeing flowers on?" Mrs. Henderson looked confused. "I'm sorry. The fresh flowers that appear every night, which grave are they on?" "Tommy, I don't know what you mean. We haven't had any reports of flowers being left overnight. The groundskeeping crew would have mentioned it." That night, Tommy brought a camera. He positioned himself behind the oak tree again, this time with a clear view of both graves. At 4:23 a.m., the elderly woman appeared again, following the same path, carrying the same careful steps. But this time, Tommy watched more carefully. The woman approached Helen's grave, not Margaret's. She knelt beside her daughter's headstone, placed fresh flowers against the stone, and began to speak in a voice Tommy could now hear clearly. "I'm sorry I'm late, sweetheart," Margaret's ghost said to her daughter's grave. "The walking gets harder every night, but I couldn't leave you alone. Not again." Tommy raised his camera, but when he looked through the viewfinder, he saw something that made his blood freeze. There were two women at the graves now, the elderly Margaret kneeling at Helen's headstone, and a younger woman kneeling at Margaret's headstone, placing identical flowers. Helen had been visiting her mother's grave at the same time Margaret had been visiting hers. Two ghosts separated by love and death, caring for each other across the impossible divide. Tommy lowered the camera and watched as mother and daughter turned toward each other. Their faces lit up with recognition and joy, and they reached out simultaneously, their translucent hands almost touching across the narrow space between their graves. "I've been looking for you, Mom," Helen said, her voice carrying the relief of someone who'd been lost for a very long time. "I know, sweetheart," Margaret replied. "I've been looking for you too." Tommy watched as the two women embraced, their forms becoming more solid, more real, as if their reunion was giving them strength. The flowers on both graves multiplied, covering the headstones with blooms of every color. Yellow roses, white lilies, red carnations, purple violets, creating a garden of love and memory. "We can go now," Helen said, taking her mother's hand. "We can go together." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I've been so tired, Helen, so tired of walking alone." As Tommy watched, mother and daughter began to fade, becoming more translucent, more peaceful. But before they disappeared entirely, Margaret turned toward the oak tree where Tommy was hiding. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying across the silent cemetery. "Thank you for witnessing our love." Tommy blinked, and they were gone. The graves were empty again, the flowers were gone, and the cemetery had returned to its normal, undisturbed quiet. But Tommy knew he'd seen something extraordinary, a love so strong that death couldn't break it, a bond so deep that it had kept two souls searching for each other across the years. He'd witnessed the end of a long journey, the resolution of a grief that had lasted decades. From that night forward, Tommy never saw the mysterious flowers again. Margaret and Helen Whitmore had found each other at last, and their eternal vigil had ended. The cemetery returned to its usual rhythm of silence and stillness, broken only by the occasional visit from the living who came to remember their own loved ones. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon was full and the air was still, Tommy would pause by the oak tree in Section D and listen carefully. And if he was very quiet, very still, he could hear something that sounded like laughter, the joyful sound of a mother and daughter who had finally come home. The cemetery held many secrets, Tommy had learned, but the greatest secret of all was that love never really dies. It just waits, patient and eternal, for the moment when separated souls can find each other again. Thanks for listening to these spine-chilling tales. If these stories kept you on the edge of your seat, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more exciting content. Leave a comment below and let me know which story gave you the most chills. I love hearing from other horror lovers. Until next time, sleep tight if you can.